Good afternoon, welcome to Speakout. I'm your host, Ann Souther. Joining me today is Bill Ritchie, a professor of art at the University of Washington. Bill takes some unusual new art forms as well. Welcome to the show, Bill.
Thanks, Ann. I'm glad to be here.
Now, a little later in the show, we're going to be seeing some of your video art. But to begin with, I'd like you to tell me why you decided on printmaking as the primary, or perhaps not the primary art form that you're involved in, but the one that you've chosen to make your living at.
Well, that goes back 15 years ago when I was an undergraduate student having to choose a subject for graduate school. I loved ceramics, but ceramic artists were a dime a dozen then. And I loved sculpture, but you had to pay very heavy dues for about 10 years before you could start making sculpture that was of any scale. And I loved printmaking. I noticed that a lot of other people didn't.
Why do you think that was so?
It's hard. And there are a lot of steps that you have to take from the time you get an idea to the time you actually have a finished piece. Mm-hmm. Whereas in painting, you know, by comparison, it's kind of hard and sometimes discouraging. So I saw a lot of students dropping out of printmaking, and I thought that might be a field, because I wanted to teach college.
Okay, so you saw printmaking then as a subject that you would teach.
Mm-hmm.
How would it be used if teaching was not your aim?
Well, printmaking was just starting into a kind of revolutionary period. It really was. In the early part of this century, let's say up to 1950, Americans weren't paying much attention to prints. And then in the 50s and 60s, well-known painters began to make very beautiful prints, and by that time the price of paintings had gone out of the limits, you know. So a famous painter who made a $10,000 or $20,000 painting might also make a print that you could buy for $200 or $300, which attracted a lot of money to keep the whole thing going. So by the 60s and 70s, printmaking was a very respectable art form to be involved with.
I see. Okay, now how does printmaking then relate to electronic art, video art? Mm-hmm. Is there another step before you get to that?
Well, my contention is that they relate historically. First, in the oldest days, we had the media of print, which conveyed, were inexpensive replications of images, and that kept science going and medicine and all kinds of technology and some art. But that was replaced by photography, and photography took over the artist's hand in some cases, and all the print media became mechanized by the photographic means. Then photographs were moved in rapid succession to produce movies, and then movies gradually moved aside a little bit for television. Today the equivalent of that kind of information movement is in the computers, for example, in computer graphics. So it's a technical relationship. And of course it progresses, in the way I put it, it's a linear progression from one thing to the next, each time becoming more complicated. But at the same time offering, it seemed like every time something got replaced or made obsolete, the artist would take it up. And this isn't so true necessarily with computer graphics. No one's been throwing out, computer graphic devices for us to use, but artists are learning the vocabulary of those new media. So there's that historical technical relationship.
Are etchings something that would come before computer graphics?
Well, in my case they do. Sometimes I see students, not necessarily so many around here, but starting out with computer graphics and then coming back to make woodcuts.
You have an example of you have an example of some etchings here.
I have
today,
an example. We arranged and brought in an example of an etching that was designed on a what do you call it, special effects generator in television. If they could put the slide up of that slide of the TV screen, we could compare it. Right. That's a slide of actually a camera pointed at another television. That was 1972, and the camera was looking at a drawing and a sunrise. The sunrise was on film, and the drawing was, of course, on paper. And then I traced that composition to this graphic. I think I can switch to the graphic now. So you see maybe you can make out the similarity if you switch them back and forth. You could almost see it with simple kind of a tracing.
So the shot of the video screen then came before the graphic, and the graphic was something that you did
Well,
after?
yeah, they grew up in that sequence, but there was a drawing, and then there was a movie and a slide in a TV studio, and then another slide. So they fed back and forth to each other.
So modern art then is really interrelated, both with the old traditional painting form as well as the new electronic forms and everything in between, it seems.
That's the way I like to see it, so that nothing replaces anything, but they coexist. And the trick is for the artist to learn the vocabulary of those things, because it isn't easy to make television, you know, and it isn't always possible for an artist to spend enough time with these new tools. But it happens, and I was one of the lucky people who got to do that. So I'm still learning the vocabulary, but I did at least keep the connection with traditional forms.
Okay, now office copying equipment is another piece of art or piece of machinery that you have used.
Right.
You have an example of that with you today too.
This is an office copy. I don't know if the camera can show that, but I'll hold it here and we'll see what we can do. This is from an office machine right here on Seattle on the Avenue. You can go in and put something down and of course get a copy for about 15 cents. Well, the interesting thing about this is that it's an office copy of a woodblock, and I brought the woodblock with me so you can see that too.
Okay.
And I think it's very funny, I don't know if anybody else does, but the funny thing about it is that the woodblock is cut in the same tradition as hundreds of years ago in Japan. And you may recognize that that's a Japanese design, but from an artist that's called the Great Wave. Now I've modified it slightly to make it my own, but it's cut in exactly the same tradition as the Japanese woodcut. But instead of printing it the way you would print a woodcut, I printed it on an office machine. You go in and there's a glass sheet, you know, and you just put it on the thing and punch a button. So you're literally taking prints from the block, but not with ink.
Is that an idea that you came up with, or is this something that has been around for a couple of years now?
It's obvious after you think about it, that you can make prints of anything, including printing blocks.
Sure.
But not in the way they're supposed to be.
It looks almost like an old map might look.
Well, that's a funny thing. What you're seeing is the wood grain, and I doubt if this will show up on television, but this is maple and has a very lovely grain. And when I first took a print of it from the machine, I hadn't thought about the wood grain very much. It was there, but when you're carving, it's as much a nuisance as anything else. But when the print came out of the machine, I was suddenly aware of the wood grain being in there. So it was like the design that I superimposed on the wood grain was in a way relating to the wood grain itself, but not in a harmonious way. Just it was a relationship that I hadn't seen that the machine showed me.
I imagine then with different kinds of wood, say a wood that had a lot of knot holes in it, you could get some tremendously interesting effects.
In fact, that's an interesting point, because around the turn of the century, when Edvard Munch comes to mind, he was a famous, still is famous Norwegian painter, and others would create their design around the knot holes. And they would use the grain of the wood as part of the form. Well, at that time, that was very revolutionary to do that, you know. But it took someone of Munch's creativity to be able to see it as more than just a reproduction process. He could see that the machines, if you see, this in a sense is a simple machine, a printing block, and they could see in the machine ideas that they couldn't have thought of if they were only painting. And so we number Munch as among those artists who showed us as artists today possibilities of artists working with machines.
There's a criticism of traditional, by traditional I mean painters, of say a form of art like photography that goes something along the lines, and you probably know more about this than I do, but that it is electronic and therefore it's not art. How would you counter that?
Oh, I think that the complaint there is that it's not made by hand. I think that's, well, there are many complaints. It's not my complaint, but it's a valid complaint that if the artist hasn't touched it, how could it be art? In other words, it's interpreted as a dehumanizing thing. that the artist didn't touch it. The collector, too, oftentimes is bothered by the fact that the artist may never have touched it, except maybe to sign the thing. In that case, the signature takes on a lot of value. But I don't like that idea, because it then means that the artist's body is more important than the artist's idea. It could mean that. And I think I'm one of those who thinks the artist's ideas are more important than their persons, their bodies themselves, you see. I think Leonardo's ideas are in many ways more important than his paintings. In fact, I read recently that Leonardo da Vinci's art was really a very small part of his main concern. It was one of the things he did, but it wasn't the main thing he did. So I think I would agree with, or he might have agreed with me, you know.
Artists are often seen as perhaps living a little bit ahead of the rest of society. Do you think that perhaps that is maybe a problem then in the way that an audience views electronic art, that they haven't come to realize that the physical involvement of an artist with his work is not perhaps as important as you're suggesting, that the ideas?
It is a problem, but I don't think the artist should be thought of as being ahead necessarily. There are many scientists, you know, and other kinds of artists like dancers and writers who, because they've chosen to be in that profession of, say, as a researcher, they have to do things that many people aren't going to understand for a long time. And that's a big problem. We've relied on critics and historians many times to pick up and interpret all this, which might take 20 years. So I usually think that an artist is easily 20 years ahead of his time. And it's going to be 20 years before people even begin to appreciate or even hear about what that person has done. But of course, in the sciences, the appearance is that sciences are useful and beneficial and so forth, and art is in some times seen as a frill or unnecessary. So you don't have the kind of work going on to interpret art and make it, quotes, useful, the way you would to interpret the benefits of, say, the space program or something like that.
I see. Speaking of the space program, that reminds me of something you were telling me before the show. You're explaining a print that you have here today where you took pictures of Planet of the Apes.
That's right.
And have arranged that over a map. And maybe we can get that on screen.
Yeah,
you can explain
that's a graphic,
that.
and I brought an original in today so that the camera could show it. Those 4 little stamps in the middle are 4 scenes from the film Planet of the Apes. There's a 13-second sequence in that film, and it shows this supposed spaceship that's crashed in this lake. You know, it's really Lake Powell in Arizona, and the background is the map of Lake Powell. And those 4 scenes, well, it's number 1, 2, 3. So the 4th scene is really scene number 20 in this 13-second sequence. But it was, it was just a Hollywood movie, you know. It wasn't really the Planet of the Apes, it was Lake Powell. And it was this fiction. And I was reminded of how in the old days in Japan, they used to sell these woodblock prints to tourists on the highway between Tokyo and Kyoto. These are very famous prints, and of course tourists would take them home, and it would show a view of Mount Fuji from a certain place and another view of Mount Fuji and so forth. Well, these were views of the spaceship crash. And I flew down there to Lake Powell to see where it was. A lot of interesting things came out of that little series that I did. That was about 1974 through 78 that I worked on that. And but the space thing was Hollywood's notion. I mean, I'm not interested in space in that context.
Now, you also have a print that was done by a computer. Is that correct? And
that's much more recent. About 3 years ago, a good friend of mine, Paul Lewis, in the School of Architecture, helped me interpret this thing that I made that's called a wave square. He helped me interpret it and put it into a computer, and then the computer would draw pictures of it, seen from different points of view. So what you see on the screen now is, let's say, view number 32, and if you can squint your eyes, you can almost see view number 33 and 34 behind it. It's done on a kind of tissue paper, and they sort of show up. But I have 54 views of this thing in that sequence. And again, it reminds me of the the 54 stations or 53 stations of the Tokaido, which is a famous
Oh,
series
right,
of Japanese
the Tokaido line
prints.
that runs between Tokyo and
Right,
Osaka.
right, and the 36 views of Mount Fuji, you know, those kinds of things. So again, it's showing the views of things. But I've taken, in that case, I didn't use Mount Fuji. I used a wave square, and I didn't use well, Mount Fuji, I guess, sums it up. I didn't use famous landmarks. I used little things that I made.
And we have one last print. Why don't we talk about that for a moment, and then we'll get into some video art.
That shows a continuation. You can see that the part of the Hokusai print, the great wave in the background, and those things they look maybe like shark fins sticking up out of the waves, those are called C-squares, because I work with the T-square as an idea, and I've warped it and made it a wave square, and I've bent it and called it a C-square. And you notice the spelling here is SEA. Those are squares that float in the sea. The complete title of that print is Mount St. Helens, seen off the coast of Washington with the Great Wave and C-squares. So this was done after last year's eruption. And I changed Mount Fuji to be Mount St. Helens and changed it a little bit. I'm still working on that print.
It sounds like you're having lots of fun with it.
Yeah, people are letting me do what I like on that.
Okay, why don't we talk a little bit about video art, because all this leads into video art, doesn't it? And perhaps you can talk a little bit about the first piece that we're going to see, which I understand is called The Hands of Carl Chu.
The Hands of Carl Chu. In fact, I think the whole title is The Hands of Carl Chu on My Father's Farm.
I see.
And the reason it has that title, Carl Chu is a man, close friend of mine, who collaborated with me in making the tape. And when you see it, you'll be able to see his hand. Actually, it looks like two hands, but one of those is a video hand. It's a mirror image of the other hand. And I don't know if it'll show. In fact, you'd have to remember the first etching that we looked at with the sunrise? That's called My Father's Farm.
I see. So this is kind of a collaboration of both of them? Or synthesis of both of them?
The etching was in the TV studio when we made it. And well, when you do these things with television cameras and point them at monitors and things, you get feedback, and different things in the camera's view will cause different kinds of feedback. And in this case, it was the etching, My Father's Farm, that was causing this kind of feedback.
Okay.
And then Carl's hand was on it, see, in between the camera and the etching, so it was on the Father's Farm, so it's called The Hands of Carl Chu on My Father's Farm.
Okay, why don't we sit back and have a look at that now?
Okay.
I think they'll have it ready. lovely. It's so
Yeah,
peaceful. How did
yeah.
you do it now?
Well, as I said, it uses feedback, which is it's like a microphone if you get it too close to the speaker.
Mm-hmm.
But a video camera, when it looks at its own monitor or its own image, will start doing this fluid-like movement.
So then you would have a television camera set up in front of a television
Mhm,
set,
mhm.
and you'd be taking pictures of the television set.
Right, and that starts this thing going, which is completely electronic. There's no water or lava lamps or anything like that.
Uh-huh.
But every time you move something, it disturbs it. So that's feedback. An interesting thing about that tape I want to mention is that Carl and I made that tape in, I don't know, 73 or something like that, in the video studio. And he went to Africa, and I was looking at the tape later and playing this music by Johann Pachelbel. It's the Canon in D by Johann Pachelbel. And I noticed they were very much alike. And I began learning about music in a way that I'd never, had a chance to do before. Carl came back from Africa, and we began actually recording the soundtrack on to the videotape. And I still feel like I'm working on that tape, partly because it can never be publicized, because the music, of course, is copyrighted, and so we don't have the rights to do anything except look at it for our own pleasures.
Mm-hmm.
But,
Okay, let's have a look at another piece that you've done called Morning,
Mhm.
and when we come back, maybe we can talk a little bit more about video art and where it fits, both in the artistic future and in the commercial future.
okay.
Okay. That's a completely different piece from the
Right.
first piece.
That's Karen Helmerson's tape. And Karen is one of about 4 or 5 video artists in Seattle. It's a real surprise for me to see it here today. Karen made that tape with Annie Groschans and Mike Holton. The whole tape is about 3 minutes long, and it was part of a tape I just put together for the King County Arts Commission. And that tape is in the libraries around Seattle now. But it shows Karen's work, it shows Alan Landy's work, Nori Sato's work as video artists, some of my own things on that tape too. The use of video as an art form is much, let's say, more widespread, let's say, in New York and in parts of California than Seattle. But there is that nucleus of people here who are doing original video work. And,
How old is the art form?
Well, I have one book that dates it back 4,000 years.
Now, what kind of video artist?
Well, the reason was, he said, the man is Frank Hubble.
Uh-huh.
He wrote a book called 4,000 Years of Television, and he said 4,000 years ago they invented the lens, and in the interim they've invented electrons and magnetism, and those are the 3 things it takes to make television go. But it's taken 4,000 years to hook them up right, to make it work. But in strictly video art terms, most people say that Nam June Paik invented it in America about 1964.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the way they reason that is that he actually had the portable camera, the Portapak it's called. The story goes that he went down to the dealer where they sell Portapaks and bought one of these things and made a tape in the taxi going back to his building. He shared the building with a lot of other artists and painters, and he walked in and said, "Painting is dead." And a lot of people say that was when video art started. Nam June Paik was a composer. He's a Korean composer who lives in America, and he's thought of as being the dean of video art. So when you talk about the history, you can say it's about 15 or 17 years old.
Okay, now what is the future then of video art? A moment ago you mentioned that because of copyright laws and that sort of thing, it can never be shown, say, over television. Where would it be shown then?
Well, we're not sure. Some of the bigger companies are interested in getting artists to make tapes for them. In the early days, it was all underground, and people just used whatever they wanted to because they never thought about a market. Now there is a market because of the home video cassette, so I imagine it'll be on the home video cassette.
And what about commercially? Is there a commercial market for video art that you foresee?
Well, the cable companies, I think, are very much attracted to it because they have lots of cables. They need lots of material to put on it. You've been probably listening to how many programs you can have if you have cable. And then there's satellite. So it's turning out that even though an artist may have only made a 3-minute piece, they don't have to make a 29.5-minute piece. It can be 3 minutes long, and maybe a cable company will buy it or give them so much for using it.
Does the material needed to participate in video art, which I imagine is quite expensive, prohibit people who might want to be involved from getting involved?
No, I don't think so. I think that we're going to see as many video artists in the next 5 years as we see painters, because anyone who is into electronics so much that they buy a video camera and a little tape deck, they can start doing feedback, and they're video artists just as much as the person who picks up an easel and starts painting a picture is an artist. Whether they make it commercially is, if you're a street singer, are you going to make it as a famous recording star? Who knows?
Bill, it's been really interesting talking with you this afternoon. I've enjoyed seeing your art, and I hope to see more of it in the future. Thank you for being with me.
Thank you.
For Speakout, I'm Ann Souther. Funds for the preceding program provided by the University Bookstore and Speakout alumni.